Okay, so again, as usual, you should have received a link to an electronic version of the worksheets. And worksheet 3.1 is a template that helps you to basically craft your story. So it's fill in the blanks that guide you through crafting your story. So if you want to go ahead and open up that worksheet, you'll see that so worksheet 3.1, it's called a guide to setting up a story about your experiences with mental illness. So on the first line, and there are instructions in the workbook. If you ever forget and want to redo this, you can always go back to them. And those instructions start on page 35 of the workbook. So the first instruction is to enter your name and what you call your mental illness, remembering back to one of those first lessons. In fact, I think it was the first lesson, right? When we talked about the fact that you don't have to label yourself as living with a mental illness to identify with, experiencing some kind of emotional struggles or difficulties about which you might want to share your story. So go ahead and name and how you identify in terms of mental health. And then the second piece that you want to do is the one that says, let me tell you about my childhood. So there's 4 blanks provided there for you. Why don't just take a moment. You can pause the video if you want to do this now and list out some of the events in your youth that are typical of most people's lives, or that might reflect the beginnings of your experience with mental illness. We know that not for everybody, but for most people, signs and symptoms of mental illness have their onset between the ages of, about 12 and 24-ish, I believe. So usually for most people, they can talk about those experiences during that time frame. For me, I identify as living with depression and anxiety, and I didn't know it at the time, like as a kid, right? But when I look back at my childhood, I can see some definite signs of the emergence of anxiety in particular. So take a moment and fill that piece out. And then on line, instruction number 3, it says list ways in which your mental illness emerged and the age that this occurred. As with all exercise in the program, do not say anything here that makes you feel uncomfortable. You share what you feel comfortable sharing. It doesn't have to be everything about your story, right? Or it could be. It all depends what you're ready for. And you only need to discuss those things that you feel okay sharing. Okay, so take a moment to do that piece. This is where my mental illness started when I was about blank years old, and then you're going to list some of those difficult things that happened. And then the next part, you see it says, unfortunately, my mental illness did not go away quickly. So you're going to list some things that you've struggled with over the past several years due to your mental health conditions. This may sound a little funny, but what this is doing is it's qualifying you. It's letting the person that you're talking with know that, yeah, this isn't just like, everyday challenges. This was some significant hurdles that I faced related to my mental health. Now the next piece, so take a moment and fill that out. You can pause the video if you'd like. The next piece is that recovery component that's so very important. So you'll see it says, I found my path of recovery living with my mental illness. What works or has worked for me includes. So there you're going to want to list some achievements and accomplishments and the things that worked to help you achieve those goals. The next component, so you can pause to fill that out. The next component is along the way, I experienced some stigma and unfair responses to my illness. And you want to list some of those experiences. That lets people know that, stigma does have a real impact on people living with mental health conditions. And sometimes that particular component of a story can inspire people to change their views about people living with mental illness. And in that regard, I think I've mentioned in a previous lesson that this program used to be titled Coming Out Proud. And the idea behind that title was, and in fact, let's go even further, it was called Coming Out Proud to Erase the Stigma Surrounding Mental Illness. So the idea that for those who do choose to disclose their illness and their associated experiences, it can be really stigma reducing for somebody to hear from somebody in their life that they have had these challenges, and look, they're living and achieving their goals, you know, maybe sometimes because of the experiences, or sometimes people say in spite of those experiences, right? Okay, so take a moment to do that. So again, I actually just foreshadowed the next piece of the worksheet. It says, despite my challenges and sometimes because of them. There's that term I think I used in a previous lesson, post-traumatic growth. Maybe I didn't, or I'm imagining it, but if I didn't, post-traumatic growth is, you know, when you go through some hard stuff, sometimes you come out stronger on the other side. So a lot of people who live with mental health conditions, you know, it's hard and they wouldn't really want to go through the suffering if they could help it, but they tend to think that it's made them into the person that they are. You know, some people feel that they're a more empathic individual because of what they've been through. Others feel like they've developed, you know, a sense of resilience in a way. And that's kind of what we mean by post-traumatic growth. You know, there's a quote that I really love that's something, I'm going to botch it, but it's something like, I've been through 100% of my hardest days, or I've made it through 100% of my hardest days, right? You're here, you've made it through all of them. So that shows strength. So go ahead and fill that piece out now. Like, what are some of the challenges, or what are some of the accomplishments you've had despite, or maybe because of your mental health? And then finally, this is kind of scripted for you, but it's really important that there's these key points that come at the end of your story. The first is, I, like all people with mental illness, live and contribute just like you. That's stigma busting, right? And then, so please treat me the same. Do not view me based on any unfair stereotypes. Those are the messages that you want people to take away from your story. So really, it's important to just remind yourself that this is your story, and ask yourself, what do you want to say? You probably don't want to communicate everything in the worksheet. You might want to reflect back on the goal that you set for yourself in terms of disclosure, which was on worksheet 1.3, and I forgot to turn my email buzzer off. Sorry about that. So one thing you might want to do now that you've written this all out, and I know that you've completed an electronic version, so maybe you do this when you get the email with the completed worksheet. Go through and circle the information in that worksheet that you think is important to for the person that you're disclosing to hear fully. And then put a line through anything that you think is maybe too personal. You know, some people think that sharing details about things like maybe an assault that they experienced might be a bit too personal for them. For others, it might not be, right? Maybe that's an important part of your story. Or there might be some things that are your reality that maybe the other person might not understand fully. Like the example that's provided in the workbook is, sometimes I hear God's voice, right? That can get confused with voice hearing that is like of clinical significance, but that might not necessarily be the case for you. That might be that you are a religious individual and you believe that you hear God's voice. So anything is fair game to either include or not include in your story. Just make sure that you're intentional and thoughtful about what it is that you do decide to include. Okay, so finally, now that you've gone through this worksheet, you've kind of scripted out a story that you would want to tell, say it out loud. So take 5 minutes now, pause your video, find a quiet space. You can go through it in your head. I oftentimes find, though, that it's really, really helpful to read something out loud. And just remember that you'll only get more comfortable with the story as time goes by and the more you say it out loud. So it might not come out perfectly the first time you say it, but the more and more you practice it, the better, and the more comfortable you'll feel with it. Pause your video now and go ahead and do that for 5 or so minutes.